Welcome back to Two-Way Tonight. If you missed our first segment, it didn't exist. This is the start of the show. I'm Mark Halperin. Welcome in. Thank you for joining. Kind of a crazy episode here because I'm having tech issues galore. But if you can hear me, give me a thumbs up. All right, there we go. Nice to know. Appreciate you joining. This is Two-Way Tonight, as I said, our evening program that we do pretty much every day during the week to review what's occurred and to project forward deep into the infinity beyond us. A few developments to tell you about regarding what's happening here at home. And then we're going to talk a little bit to our friends from International Intrigue about Syria and what's up there. Lots going on today on that front, which is still pretty confusing. All right. So most of what happened today that didn't involve Syria related to the Trump administration, incoming administration, and what's up with them. I'm going to tell you about that. As always, like to remind you, the ethos of this platform is peace, love, and understanding, the presumption of grace extended to all. Everybody gets 2 passes, so make sure you choose wisely there. If you'd like to participate in the program and you're here in the Two-Way platform, please raise your electronic hand. It's a little yellow hand. Looks like something you might see in the Sgt. Pepper film. If you're watching on YouTube, don't raise your hand, but don't put trash in the chat. I don't read the chat on YouTube. That's true fact. I don't even know what it looks like. But I do know that if you put trash in the chat, you're not adhering to the ethos of this platform, and we don't like it. So please do not put negativity in the chat. Spirited debate, excellent. Questions, fantastic. Challenging someone else's premise in a respectful manner, good on you. But putting in scatologically negative things or personal criticisms or attacks on my weight in particular are not welcome here. All right. So Laura Trump told the Associated Press in a recent interview, sure, I'd become senator from Florida if people wanted me to, and announced that she was not seeking re-election to her job helping run the Republican National Committee. Now, this incremental but important increase in our knowledge of what's going on from the Wall Street Journal, please put up the headline, ran just a little while ago. The Wall Street Journal reporting that just as we now know that Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis recently discussed the possibility of Ron DeSantis becoming Secretary of Defense in a Trump administration, according to Wall Street Journal's Alex Leary, who is on this story like a Slurpee on sugar, Trump spoke to DeSantis about choosing Laura Trump for Florida Senate seat. If I were the headline writer, a little confusing to say Trump spoke choosing Laura Trump. Maybe if you put Trump in a headline, it means Donald Trump as the default. In any event, the story says that DeSantis knows that Donald Trump wants that. It says, it repeats the notion that Laura Trump is interested. It also says, you can take the headline down, that some in DeSantis's orbit are a little concerned that if he got the nod for defense secretary, which is widely reported one he would take, and he appointed Laura Trump to the Senate, some might see that as a quid pro quo. Now, I have reported, as perhaps you remember if you listen to everything I say and retain it, something no one really does, that Ron DeSantis wants to run for president again someday, and that a big obstacle, perhaps the biggest, yes, the biggest actually, don't hedge, is he's got to get right with MAGA. And being Trump's defense secretary could help him get right with MAGA. So could appointing Laura Trump to the Senate seat. There are other people who are on his radar. So that is kind of hanging out there. This notion that he and Trump have talked about it, maybe it'll happen. And I read her Associated Press comments to suggest that she thinks maybe she's going to get it because, I don't know. I just read her comments to make it seem like she thought she was getting it. I don't want to say more than that. Now, bigger news, and yes, you may accuse me of burying the lead. After current Trump defense secretary nominee designates Pete Hegseth met with Iowa Senator Joni Ernst. Joni Ernst emerged from the meeting and put out what, in the context of the nomination process, I consider to be a blockbuster statement. Please, producers, put up the blockbuster statement. This Ernst statement has been touted on the X platform owned by Elon Musk, formerly known as Twitter, as suggesting that Ernst was endorsing Hegseth, Read it carefully. It doesn't say that. However, it is very supportive. I appreciate Pete Hegseth's responsiveness and respect for the process. Following our encouraging conversations, Pete committed to completing a full audit of the Pentagon and selecting a senior official who will uphold the order, the roles and value of our servicemen and women based on quality and standards, not quotas, and who will prioritize and strengthen my work to prevent sexual assault within the ranks. As I support Pete through this process, I look forward to a fair hearing based on truth, not anonymous sources. All right, the last sentence is the key. First of all, I don't recall ever a senator putting out a statement saying that they support someone through this process. Now, you could read that. No, leave the statement up, please. I gotta annotate it like it's going out of business. I support him through the process could mean I'm endorsing him, and I'll continue to through the process. That's not how it's being read, though. It's being read as she's supporting him through the process, through the process she's supporting him, not necessarily voting for him. I look forward to a fair hearing. Everybody wants that. Based on truth, everybody should want that, not anonymous sources. And that's an interesting thing for her to highlight, to say, and we've said here before, nearly every major allegation against Pete Hegseth in this entire process, and many different categories of allegations, have been done anonymously. And it seems like the senator's saying she doesn't like that any more than Pete Hegseth does. So you can take it down now. This morning on the morning meeting, we read you a statement from Tom Cotton, political analyst who also happens to be a U.S. senator, who said he thought every nominee would be confirmed, not, of course, Matt Gaetz, already gone. And I take that seriously because Tom Cotton is a serious fellow who understands the Senate conference, and he might be right. Now, I already see, because although I do not read Twitter much more carefully than I read the comments here, I do know some people are pointing to the thing I said last week when I reported that don't be surprised if by the weekend, Ron DeSantis had replaced Pete Hegseth. If you ask the people helping Pete Hegseth with his confirmation process, was there a good chance his nomination was dead last week and he was going to be replaced by Ron DeSantis? They would tell you yes. This is not something I made up, nor was my source unreliable or wrong. And I said I only had one source. My source was right. My source said, a very good source, said, don't be surprised if by the weekend, that's the track we're on, of last week into last weekend, that Hegseth out, DeSantis in. What has happened in the interim? First of all, the team working with him, I've praised them publicly before, they're excellent. If the guy gets confirmed, he needs to be like an NFL quarterback who wins a Super Bowl, and they're his offensive line, and he buys them all like a new car, really expensive watches, because they're doing a great job. And they understand how the confirmation process works. They basically got all these senators who were wavering publicly and some privately to say, all these sources are anonymous. Pete really deserves a chance. Give him a chance. Meet with him. Let's get to the hearing process. And I think they've succeeded. And the Ernst is Exhibit A. Now, couple things. As I've said before, there still could be revelations that are new that change the dynamics of the race. And I do believe there's some more investigative pieces in the works. Second, there's a possibility still that one of the senators who does not think Pete Hegseth is the right person for this job and who wants to save Donald Trump from a long drawn-out process, which will end closer to Inauguration Day with no nominee confirmed and Trump having to start over, it's possible that one of those senators will come out and say, I oppose Pete Hegseth's nomination, a Republican senator, on the theory that others then would feel comfortable saying the same thing publicly or privately, and the White House would withdraw the nomination and move more expeditiously towards finding a replacement. But those things may not happen, or they may not impact Trump's determination at this time to go ahead. So if you wanted to write a history of what's occurred, you wouldn't say Halperin was wrong, Hegseth was never in any trouble. You'd say last week this thing was on the political equivalent, to use the cliche, of life support. And through the efforts of Pete Hegseth and his team, he now has gotten the process back on track, where I believe he's more likely than not to get a hearing. And big change for me, you're hearing it out of my mouth for the very first time, I believe now he's a better than 50% chance to be confirmed, barring any new revelations. We'll see where it goes. But that is, again, if you're a student, a political scientist, or you're someone who someday faces a rocky path to Senate confirmation, you want to study the techniques used by the Hegseth team. We've talked about it a lot on this program and on the morning meeting. I will say not all of them, but almost all of them applicable to Democratic nominees as well. Very, very smart use of media, social media, alliances, and understanding the Senate process. These senators are as easy to understand as a 6-year-old child. And I say that with no disrespect meant to 6-year-old children. They understand, and the Hegseth team, how you play to the senators' interests, their vanities, their concerns, their support for the advise and consent process. They just did a bang-up job in getting the senators to not come out publicly against him and to be willing to listen to him. And in the case of Joni Ernst, practically running the nomination process. So with that, let's bring in our all-star team. If you've never missed an episode of this program, go ahead and bring in the three folks from Intrigue, please. If you've never missed an episode of this program, then you've seen our three guests tonight previously, but many of you new to the platform have not. So let me tell you, International Intrigue is a newsletter that comes out 5 days a week on international affairs. And it was started by and is written by, along with a few other colleagues, 3 former Australian diplomats who gave up the Diplo Dodge, John Fowler, you like that, the Diplo Dodge, and became a version, not of pure journalists, but of people in the content dodge, the content game, the content carny. How about that, content carny? They bring to writing about international affairs every day, I would say, a cheeky sensibility, which is good, but a level of expertise that, let's be honest, a lot of journalists who write about international affairs, they don't know anything more about international affairs than I know about Scottish rugby, which is not a lot. Meet Jeremy Dicker, Helen Zhang, and John Fowler, all of whom, as I said, former diplomats who write this extraordinary newsletter every day. It's informative, it's breezy, it's serious. It's all the things we aspire to be here at Two Way. They are our role models, in other words. And we're happy to have them here to talk about this extraordinarily interesting, serious, and complicated story. After I kick it around a little bit with them, like we're playing hacky sack, you all will get a chance to ask them questions as well. So get ready for that. And if you want to ask them about Australia, as I often do when I get a chance to talk to them, I'll allow it tonight. But mostly we're going to talk about Syria. John, Jeremy, and Helen, been a while since I've seen you. Happy holidays. And I don't think we say in Australia, maybe we do, welcome in. Do we say that in Australia? Welcome in?
Sure. Why not?
We get it.
All right. Where are you guys tonight? Are you in your usual home bases? Chicago, New York, and Australia?
Boston.
Boston.
Washington, D.C., actually.
Well, yeah, Washington. All right, that's what I meant. Washington, Boston, and Australia. Jeremy, you're on the other side of the planet. How's it over? How's it over there? How do you celebrate Christmas in Australia?
It's paradise here. I live in Noosa, which is northeastern Australia. We celebrate Christmas. It's hot. People go to the beach. People have a barbecue, swim in the pool. It's a pretty nice way to spend a day with family and friends.
All right, Helen, here's my opening question for you. What is the true meaning of Christmas? No, that's too hard. What are you doing? What are you doing for the holidays, Helen?
I am actually heading back to Australia. So I'm going to be this time on the western side of Australia with my partner who is from there. So the distance between East and West Australia is pretty similar to East Coast US to West Coast US. It's very far. But I will also be on the beach and, hopefully sipping some nice beverages and kicking back.
Awesome. John Fowler, the obvious question for you. Did you see any of the concerts on the Eras tour before it ended?
Just 3, Mark. Just the 3.
No. Did you go to any?
I didn't. I did not. I can't afford that. Are you kidding me?
Big mistake.
I wonder what that charge to our card was, John.
Yeah,
now
exactly.
It explains a lot.
Any of you, I throw this up as a jump on, then we'll talk about Syria. Explain in better than I did what International Intrigue is, why you write it, who you write it for, why people would find it an attractive thing to add to their media diet.
I think you did a pretty good job, Mark. It's a short daily newsletter that was founded basically to help folks who don't necessarily come from the world of diplomacy and international relations understand what the heck is going on in this increasingly crazy world. So we take the biggest stories of the day, the biggest global geopolitical stories of the day, break them down, help you figure out what just happened, and then give you a few hints on what we think's coming next. But we're particularly for your audience, because I know this is what you do, Mark. We're apolitical. We don't take sides from a political standpoint. We just try to give people the facts and give them the benefit of our experience and what we think's coming. And we do it with humor and a little bit of lightheartedness because there's so much serious stuff out there already.
All right. I've got a bunch of questions about Syria, and I follow the coverage, but I'm no expert. I've never been there. First of all, have any of you ever been to Syria? Anybody? No. Okay.
Helen's
No.
the closest.
I'm going to throw them up as a jump ball, and whoever wants to jump in can, and you can finish each other's sentences in that adorable way you do. First, if people talked about Assad being overthrown for a long time, and whether he had a grip on power and how reliant he was on the Russians and the Iranians, etc. Why did it happen now? Why did this occur now?
I might jump in there, everyone. I think so. To answer your question, actually, Mark, I have been to the Golan Heights, so in Israel, on the side of Israel, which was then recognized by the US in 2019. So I think the best way to think about this is that Assad's regime had been sort of quite brittle, and we're on the verge of kind of falling apart until Russians came in 2015 and really swung the game in their favor. So since then, I think we've wrote in our newsletter today, they've been supported by Russian air power and Iranian ground power. So I think when you've seen the weakening of both the Iranian regime as well as the Russian regime, thanks to their various fights on various fronts, that's kind of contributed to the perfect storm to weaken the Alawite Syrian regime with Assad to allow for the rebels to make a final push. And honestly, I think there's a lot of people who had underestimated the rebels because they had been really out of the picture for such a long period of time. So people just assumed that they no longer had the sort of thrust to be able to do this. But that's sort of the perfect storm, you know, in terms of laying the scene for everyone to understand where we're at today and how it's gotten to this place.
Okay. So obviously Syria has been an effed up country because it's been run by a murderous dictator. Does it have natural resources? Could it be a place for tourism? Like, what are its strengths potentially as a vibrant economy or nation freed from Assad? Not that the new government is necessarily going to open a bunch of Ritz-Carltons, but longer term, if somehow this ends well for the Syrian people and they end up getting a government and a free market and all that, like what has it got going for it, Syria?
I mean, John and Jeremy, please feel free to jump in here, but I'm going to weigh in once more because I think for those of us who are sort of old enough to remember, a lot of the Arabic language training used to be done in Damascus in Syria. So for a long time, Syria and Damascus were seen as the Paris of the Middle East. It was a city that had a lot of history and a lot of culture, and the country itself had a lot of the best UNESCO World Heritage sites around Syria. But in addition to sort of, you know, the tourism industry, which kind of, I think Assad had tried to start it. I think on my way to Doha earlier this year, I saw an ad, someone on a jet ski, on the back of a jet ski, going around the Mediterranean. I was like, oh, where is that? It looks wonderful. It's actually Syria. So I think, you know, the country definitely has a lot of potential in the tourism industry, but also it is a strategic country because it's really smack bang in the middle of the Levant on the western side of the Middle East. So strategically, it's a very important position for the region. And then also, of course, the oil fields, which is why the ISIS were there as well. But I'm going to pause here so I don't monopolize the conversation.
That's all excellent. You're providing excellent information, and these guys are good listeners, so that's fine. How do the Saudis feel about what's going on?
JD, shoot.
Well, I think they have mixed feelings about this. Fundamentally, they want stability, and they have been also pushing to establish themselves as regional leaders. And I think on both fronts, this probably hasn't played out as they might have expected. They were caught by surprise like everyone else, and they're potentially looking down the barrel of another decade or more of instability in Syria, depending on what happens next. It's really all in a state of flux right now. But also in terms of their ambitions to be a regional leader, I mean, they weren't really driving this. It's really been other regional powers like the Turks who've been driving this. And so, you know, I think the Saudis will have kind of mixed feelings about this. I think they'll be a little wary about the folks who are leading the transition, which is an Islamist group called HST. They have their roots in groups like Al-Qaeda, like from a decade ago. And those sorts of groups spook the Saudis because they reject these kind of rich Gulf monarchy approaches to running, you know, Islamic majority countries like the Saudis. So I think they're going to be pretty pretty wary about where this is all heading.
And they had just made friends with Assad just before, right? I think Assad had
Yes.
famously been brought back into the fold with the Shiites, you know, embracing a Sunni majority country, and then now the Saudis have to go back to square one.
Is there anything like a middle class, an upper middle class, educated class in Syria the way there is in Iran? So people always say, well, if there's a revolution in Iran and there's an opening, maybe the middle class would assert itself. Is there a population like that in Syria?
I'll let Helen chime in. I think the thing with Syria is that a lot of those folks left. So London has a huge population of
but
Syrians
some could go back now, right?
Well, that's the unknown, and I think a lot of it depends on what happens now. If there is some semblance of governance where this new guy says, "Okay, we're going to try and rebuild the country," then maybe they will come back. It'll probably take a little while for them to trust that that's the new normal. But if it doesn't happen, if it becomes chaotic, or if it breaks down into kind of, you know, the regional fighting or the sect on sect fighting really in Syria, because it's, I mean, one really important bit of context about Syria is that I don't know that there's a more diverse country in the world, maybe in terms of religions, sects, families, all these kinds of things. So they might come back from abroad, but it depends on what happens next. Helen, do you have any views on that?
Yeah, I think there are some still there. And you've seen that a lot of them have been released as political prisoners recently in the last couple of days. So I think the ones who are still in Syria very much could form a sort of middle class support of the new regime coming in. But again, it's the actions and not words of Golani, the leader from HTS, which is going to speak volumes. And also, I think in addition to that, what the appetite of the West is in terms of supporting this, and whether or not, you know, the Turks are going to play a role, the US famously, and then also the UK. So I think if you think back to when this whole thing happened back in the early 2010s, the West had been a really big part of pushing the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, which was the opposition then, in support of defeating the Assad regime. But that's all changed now with NATO looking at Ukraine, and then the US looking more inwards. So where we were back then versus where we are now is very different. So even if there is a middle class pushing for sort of, you know, quote unquote Western values, it would be a very different set of play than it was 10 years ago.
My general view is if people suspect Israel might have played a role in something, Israel probably played a role in something. So what do we know about what Israel might have done in fostering this or not?
I mean, Helen served in Israel, but I'll just chime in and say, I mean, we know clearly that Israel played a role in the fact that over the last year, as Israel gradually shifted its attention from Hamas in Gaza over towards Hezbollah in Lebanon, part of their strategy against Hezbollah was cutting off their suppliers, which meant bombing parts of Syria where the Iranians were using as a pipeline to get supplies to Hezbollah. So that year of bombing Syrian defense facilities, airfields, arms manufacturing facilities, that has gradually weakened the Syrian regime even further, which combined with what Helen said about losing Hezbollah ground support and Russian air support, it was all part of that perfect storm. So yeah, Israel, openly, they never admitted these bombings, but I mean, yeah, they definitely played a role in contributing to this perfect storm.
What is? Go ahead, Helen.
Go ahead.
No, you go.
No, I think there's no sort of secret in terms of, you know, Israel wanting to degrade the Iranian Shiite proxies in Syria, as well as Lebanon, as well as parts of Iraq, and then also Yemen, right? So with Syria, indirectly, they have contributed to it through degrading Iranian support and degrading the Lebanese sort of Hezbollah Shiites on the ground. But then also directly, they have been actually supporting the Syrian rebel forces on the border with Israel for many years. They had hospitals there with Syrians coming over to be treated and then sent back to Syria. And I think, you know, in some ways, the Israeli defense establishment is a little bit perplexed on what to do next, because sometimes better the devil you know. They don't like Assad, but they know that at least he's not going to attack them anytime soon.
Yeah.
So now the big question for Israel is that, all right, they've taken a big gambit. Let's see what happens with HTS and what Golani's actual thoughts on Israel and the southern border will be.
All right, we've got some hands up, but again, if you'd like to get in on the conversation, please raise your hand. We're going to in just a moment. What's in it for Putin to take Assad in? Why is that in his interest?
That's a good question. I don't really know. I suppose just because he's been responsible for kind of propping him up, and I suspect he's probably got I mean, you guys can chime in too. I guess Assad probably has a lot of networks and patronage and friends in the area. You know, Putin's biggest thing now is he doesn't want to lose Russia's naval base on the Syrian coast. So I don't know. I guess maybe the question would be, why wouldn't he? What does he lose by just saying, yeah, take a dasher on up by a lake outside Moscow, and when I need help, I'll call you. If you can put me in contact with people, maybe. But I don't know.
Well, okay, and relatedly, why isn't there more talk about Assad trying to go back? Like, I don't hear people
back
talking
to Syria.
Yeah,
I think he'd be strung up from a light post. Like,
well, no,
Mussolini.
but
Correct,
couldn't he work the phones and coalesce his support? Like
I think that Syria, the Middle East
what has he lost all of a sudden? He had an iron grip on the country, and now you guys are saying it's implausible he could go back. Who's turned against him in such decisive ways?
Well, I think Russia and Hezbollah leaving is the problem. Like he has no one. The Alawites, the ruling, sect, tiny, really, really small. There was always an iron-fisted rule of the minority in Syria. Hence the brutalism of it and the locking up of people. And so when you lose that, previously before the Arab Spring, it was like he had his own powers and Iranian backing, but after that it was Russia and Hezbollah. That's gone. So he literally would go back and go, stop doing this, and no one would listen to him. Is my view.
Humorously,
that's absolutely right.
On his way, when he was fleeing to Russia, he supposedly issued a statement ordering for a peaceful transfer over to the rebels, which is ridiculous. Like, no one was listening to him anymore. That's like the captain of that Titanic ordering a peaceful, sinking into the sea.
Evacuation.
Yeah, thanks, bro.
Yeah. I mean, Mark, to your question earlier, I think that, Putin really also still wants to project power. I think if you cast your mind back to the Obama years, the reason people say one of the triggers for him coming into Syria was Obama saying that Russia was a regional power as opposed to a global power. So, part of his power projection is also saying, oh, we are magnanimous and we're going to take Syria back, or Assad, our sort of allies, back into our fold. So this is definitely one of those calculations by Putin as well.
Okay, one more for me, and then again, go to your questions. What's the best case for the people of Syria and the world now that's plausible? How would you see the next few days, weeks, months playing out in the realm of possibility, where there's the least number of people who die, the most stability, the most fostering of a, ping pong events, battering around here that lead to more peace? How would that scenario play out? The best case.
Well, one way to answer that is that this guy, Jelani, who has like Al-Qaeda roots, he's been in the process of an epic rebrand, trying to convince everyone that he wants to build a Syria for all. He's not going to harm minorities. So he's been doing that to convince all the other factions of Syria and the international community to trust him and invest in the project he's promising to build in Syria. So if enough of those factions believe that and give it a shot, if enough of the international community believe that and give it a shot, then best case scenario is we see some kind of pluralistic, multi-ethnic government emerge.
I lie. I have another question. I've not heard talk of this, but again, I don't read every little thing. Why isn't there more talk about partition of the country? And if there were, what would that look like? In other words, are there natural geographical, ethnic, religion splits where you could see southern Syria, eastern Syria, etc.?
Partition's a tough word, just because that's kind of what caused a lot of these problems in that area in the first place in the mid 20th century. I think, Helen, you know a lot more about this than I do. I think that's actually probably the best case scenario, is that they somehow come up with a way to divide Syria or governance of Syria into different groups. But the problem is, Mark, is that you need an arbiter. You need a good faith organizer of those kinds of talks, of those kinds of arrangements. We know Trump doesn't want to get involved. I suspect he will be forced to get involved at some point during his second term, but America doesn't seem like it's going to play that role. I don't think the UN can play that role credibly. Israel, no regional power really can. Maybe the Saudis, but I don't think so. So I think that's probably why there's not a lot of talk of it, but I think that'd be a good result. Do you agree with that, Helen?
I agree. And I think the most clear sort of partition is Kurdistan, right? I think Kurdistan split between Turkey and Syria is something that has been...
Erdogan will never let that happen.
Exactly. It's been a thorn in Erdogan's side for a little while. And then I think we've also got to remember, in terms of the opposite of the best case scenario, worst case scenario, ISIS coming back. I know this is something that is not looking too likely right now, but they are still on the eastern side of the country, and the US military actually just conducted airstrikes there to sort of ensure that there's no further advancements of ISIS to take advantage of the situation. So I think if you're looking at a clear breakup of the country, yes, it can be segmented in roughly the sort of northeast and then the west and the southeast. But of course, as John rightly said, who's going to be the arbiter? Who's got the appetite and the sort of patience for that right now, given everything else that's happened? And we're still not even at the end of 2024. So
China.
who knows what else is coming?
Right. All right.
Correct.
China would be excellent. Clay, welcome in. Tell folks where you are and ask away.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you, Mark. From Alabama.
Oh, cool.
Here in Birmingham. Been a big 6 months for me. Got promoted and got married, got my MBA, and now I'm on two-way. So, it's
Clay, I can say with some degree of confidence, you've had a better 6 months than Assad.
Yes.
Congratulations.
Absolutely.
Congratulations on all that. And we're glad to have you here. So floor is yours, sir.
Well, thank you. Being an Alabama grad, my wife is an SMU grad. So it's been a really tenuous, I'm sure, Mark, you follow college and all you guys follow all the, here in Alabama, it's really big, but college football anyway. So we're reeling from that. But it's great to talk to each of you guys. Just curious about the refugee crisis. I saw where I think Britain and France said, they're not looking to take in Syrian refugees for that. And, I've been seeing, about Sweden and Stockholm, what's happened there when they, took all the refugees there, and I'm seeing the Palestinian crisis. It's just like no one wants these people. And it's really sad and it's heartbreaking to see, and it's always the people, on that level that are going to get hurt the most. And so what do you see as the process for that? And then on the other side, with this opening, I mean, do you see, I think, Mark, you were talking about, China potentially getting involved in the Middle East like that, because it's kind of, because Trump is put out there saying he doesn't want anything to do with it. Like he just wants to stay out of it altogether. So, power hates a vacuum. So I guess what's it like from the people that are there, and then, on up for international players who are going to look to exploit this opportunity.
Great questions, Clay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Folks, what do you think?
Sure, Clay, thank you so much. I'll take the first one. I think, in terms of the refugee crisis, the biggest absorber of refugees from Syria in the last few years had actually been Lebanon and Turkey, right? So its neighbors that had taken in most of its refugees. So I think hopefully with the removal of Assad, there's actually going to be more people who can return to the country to rebuild the country. So I think that this is actually ultimately a good thing for Syrian refugees who have been, living in really appalling conditions in the Mediterranean Rim and the Levant region, and that hopefully their lives are going to get better. I think just quickly speaking on the arbiter, the second question, China, yes, maybe, but also I think the Gulf states are now increasingly looking to be more of a sort of mediator type of role in the region, right? I think they recognize that the Middle East really has to chart its own course. So somewhere like the UAE perhaps, or Doha might play a role in this. I don't think China's got any appetite right now and capability to be the sort of arbiter that it needs to be. And John shaking his head, please come in.
No, I with China, I agree entirely. China wants all the credit for solving problems, but doesn't want to do any of the work for actually trying to solve them. So I don't see China as being particularly credible player on that front. They'll probably say the right things and they might facilitate some. I don't think they'll hurt the situation, but they're not kind of going to play the role that the US might, or the UN or the EU might have in times gone past. I think Helen's exactly right. Qatar they love to try and negotiate these kinds of things. The UAE as well. So they're probably the most likely ones. But yeah, if the problem is Turkey is going to want to have I see Turkey as being basically emerging at some point in the future, and that could be 6 months or 6 years, but Turkey will become the hegemon of the region, and it will kind of own Syria, as it were.
Clay, thank you for sharing all the good news with us. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you, Clay.
You'll come back regularly. Congratulations.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Hassan, welcome in. Tell folks where you are who don't know and what's on your mind.
No, Hold on. Are we? Yeah.
Am I unmuted?
Yep, you're all good. We hear you fine.
Well, Mark, I suspect I'm the only person on this call that has actually met with Bashar al-Assad. I went to Syria on a delegation with the Rand Corporation with Brzezinski as the chair, and we met with him in 2008. It was somewhat controversial because at that time, Brzezinski was the senior foreign policy advisor to the Obama campaign, and I was the national finance chair for Hillary, and we both got outed in the New York Sun for having met with him. That having been said as background, my question to you, and you began to allude to it, because in your preamble, you said nothing about Turkey and the Kurds. And I suspect that the real pressure point here is going to be Turkey, what their ambitions are, and the problem that you have with the Kurds always wanting a homeland for themselves. And they have been supported throughout this process by the Turks. But when you talk in terms of partition, the last thing that the Turks want is partition in that region, because that will put, again, a lot of pressure on the Kurds' ambition for a separate state, which is contrary to anything that the Turks want. The other thing that's been reported in the Iranian press, and I'm Iranian American by origin, the Iranians obviously have been the greatest losers in the whole Syria question. In the Iranian press, there's been a lot of discussion about what the UAE and the Qataris have been doing to try to move Assad away from the Iranians over the course of the last year. That obviously sort of went up in a puff of smoke in the course of the last 7 days. But my question to you is, what do you see as Erdogan's endgame here? What does he actually want to see as a resulting outcome for this?
Yeah. Before you guys answer, I'll just say huge oversight on my part and uncharacteristic, because I agree with, I think, what the premise of your question is, which is in any international situation that involves tension between the Kurds and Turkey, you're going to have massive complexity because it's an unsolvable division, and it always makes things more difficult for the United States to be involved, because the United States has people who side with the Kurds, and it has people who want to, do whatever Erdogan wants, because there's other considerations related to NATO, et cetera. So I totally agree with you, and I failed to mention it because I'm an idiot. That's my explanation.
No,
all right, so
no.
folks, just talk about the through line here of the complexity of the aspirations of the Kurds, as well as Turkey's nonstop desire to keep the Kurds from having a homeland and self-determination.
Well, maybe I could just start with a historical point before handing over to Helen and John. But if we go back exactly 100 years, this whole area was the Ottoman Empire, right? Run essentially by Turkey, and they lost that. So there are people in Erdogan's circle who will see what's happening now as a return to what should be, in their view, a status of normality. Which means what John mentioned before, as Turkey is the main player in the region. So I think Erdogan, when you combine that history that motivates the sensibilities of Erdogan and a few people around him, and then you combine that with the particular ego and personality of Erdogan, he sees himself as a world leader, as a great man of history. Those two things combined, I think, partly give the answer to the question, which is that Turkey wants to reassert itself as the player in the region, and it's been working hard across that. What about you, Helen?
I think that, yeah, that's absolutely right. Big picture. And then I think going down into the sort of granular stuff on the ground, Turkey is going to do everything it can to prevent the Kurds from getting a contiguous sort of like territory from east to west of where they currently are. So that's what they're going to try to do. Like Turkey will continue to sort of contain them in a sort of pocket that does not cut across the east and west of Syria and Turkey's border. And I think Turkey is going to try and work with Golani and sort of whatever the new formation of the new Syrian government might look like to ensure that they are aligned on this, to make sure that they're all, on the same page about not giving the Kurds their own territory. So I think actually, in many ways, Turkey's in a very strong position because there's not really many other allies for Galani to work with right now. What do you
And
reckon, John?
they seem
Oh
to have
yeah,
backed Galani. Like the
yeah,
relationship is murky, but it seems like their Turkish intelligence was in touch with Galani, helped
that's
in
right.
several ways, and it even seemed like Erdogan kind of gave the green light for them to move in and topple the Assad regime. John?
Yeah, I agree. I suspect that Erdogan's kind of fever dream would be propping up a Syrian government where he gets to basically do what the Iranians and the Russians did for Syria over the last 10 years, but he gets to say, oh, by the way, I'm going to go bomb the Kurds again. Don't tell anyone. And he just gets to control everything that
Or look the
happens
other
in
way.
Syria without really having to do much. So I think, yeah, someone said before, nature abhors a vacuum. And I think everyone in the region is probably united in the sense that they do not want this to devolve into another civil war, into factional fighting, into chaos, into all the refugee flows, or terrorism. I mean, we saw Israel bomb the chemical weapons facilities in Damascus. So there's that element. There's a ton of biological weapons on the loose now in Syria. So if Erdogan can kind of swiftly move in, prop up a government that at least controls Syria in some way, that would be his dream, I think.
Hassan, thank you for joining. Go ahead.
Can I ask one follow-up question?
Of course.
How do you view the Saudis and the Israelis viewing the fact that Erdogan will be the person who's the key player in Syria in the future?
Very quickly, I think Israel won't be thrilled by it, but I think you have to kind of look at he would be replacing Iran. And I think both Saudi and Israel probably prefer Turkey to Iran. They can at least work with Turkey. They can kind of come to some red line. You don't do this, we won't do this kind of negotiation, where obviously with Iran, there's absolutely no chance of that. So they're probably on balance happier, but it's not going to be easy. They're not friends in any way. Helen?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. I think that in many ways, because Turkey is part of NATO and is like a US ally, longtime US ally, I think the Saudis and the Israelis are also US allies. So in many ways, it's just an easier frenemy to work with. Of course, there's a lot of ongoing issues bilaterally with Israel and Turkey that they need to resolve, related to the Palestinian conflict as well. But I think on balance, it's probably a good outcome for Israel as well as Saudis.
Hassan, thank you for joining.
Thank
Love
you.
when you come back regularly, please. All right, Haley, come on
Thank
in.
you, Hassan.
Tell folks where you are and what's on your mind, please.
Hi, thanks for having me again. I'm so excited to talk to people who really understand what's going on, because I feel like I've been getting information because full disclosure, I'm Israeli American, so I do watch Israeli news and I watch American, and I feel like getting so many different kinds of information. Also, full disclosure, served in the IDF, my whole family did. So basically my question is, I know that the Israelis didn't just deploy troops, obviously not going into Syria. However, I do know that there was a takeover of Mount Hermon in Israel. So I just want to know, like, from the Israeli standpoint, like, what are because I know the rebels are comprised of so many different types of factions, some who are Islamists, some who claim they aren't, and I know that Israel is very protective of the Druze community in northern Syria. So I'm just trying to understand what is the best case scenario for the Israel American, for their, what are they looking for and what do they hope will come out of it, rather than, being okay with Turkey taking, because it's just so complicated that it's just so difficult to understand really who should we be rooting for, who should we be backing, if we should be backing anybody, if we should be it's just a mess.
Great question, Haley. Thank you. Guys, what do you think?
I mean, Haley, it's a total mess, right? I have been to the Syrian Golan Heights, and there's famously this winery there called Pelter, which is actually someone who trained in Australia. This guy called Tal, and he was looking over it. The winery looks onto Syrian Golan Heights, right? So you're sort of sitting there thinking about how close the sort of two countries are. I think the best case scenario is that Israel and Syria normalizes ties, that the two countries actually can have normal diplomatic relations after this many years. And so I think that is something that it's not going to come immediately, but I think that if there is regional acquiescence and support, then that's the sort of best case scenario where they can normalize ties. But the worst case scenario is if ISIS comes back to the border, which is why I think the IDF has been deployed to get to this sort of demilitarized zone. They're not in Syria. I think it's been often misreported in the last couple of days about them entering Syria. Not the case, obviously, but for them to sort of ensure that there's no overspill of the rebel factions that the Golani and HTS cannot control, because let's not forget also Syria is a huge country, and where the northwest is in Damascus is very far away from the Syrian Golan Heights on the border to Israel.
Right.
So thank you for your service, Haley. I know it's it's not easy being in the IDF, so really appreciate you sharing your views and
these
I was
days.
just going to add, sorry, Haley, that Jelani has made a couple of interesting comments in the last few days. He said
that's
that
also what I heard. That's what I just wanted to mention. Yeah, like I heard him speaking to the BBC saying different things than what his background, but then I hear the reporting that he's Al-Qaeda. It's just, where do we think he stands at the moment is basically like my concern.
Yeah. So for folks who might not have followed, he's described his own journey. He said he got radicalized by the Second Intifada in the early 2000s, and that motivated him to go and join terrorist groups, and he ended up going into Iraq and joining Al-Qaeda. So, and then founding Al-Nusra. So he has this like hardcore jihadi background, but he's reflected on it and described it as like a misspent youth. And time is going to tell whether this is just, rebranding or authentic. Exactly. The last couple of days, he said some interesting comments about Israel. He said, we don't have any, Israel's not an enemy. We have no enemy other than Iran and Hezbollah. And he said, in fact, Israel helped by, bombing the Assad regime. And so it's extremely complex. And a lot of the answer to your question depends on which guy turns up. Is it the radicalized, terrorist from a decade ago? Or is it this kind of reformed guy that we're seeing on BBC and CNN in the last few days? We don't know.
Absolutely. And just a quick comment, just based on Israeli news, they are thrilled about Assad, like just based on their perspective, the journalist, all of Israeli media. I mean, I haven't heard anything of them saying this is bad, like this is something the new normal. They're excited for it. So I just want to give that out there also.
Haley, thanks for coming on. Appreciate you having me here. Thank you so much. Bella, welcome, and tell folks where you are. What's on your mind, please?
Oh, unmute.
You're unmuted. You're good. We hear you.
I'm unmuted. So I was excited to hear that there are 3 people from Australia, because the news from Australia as far as anti-Semitism and the synagogue firebombing. So I was wondering what you think about that. What do you think about the administration in Australia and how they've sort of veered away from being responsible for what is really happening? I understand that in Australia there are a lot of Jews who are leaving.
Great question.
I don't know. I mean, maybe I can chime in. Yeah, I live in Australia, and all 3 of us are Australian. It's a really good question, Bella. There was a firebombing of a mosque in Melbourne, one of our 2 largest cities. There were people injured. Thankfully, no one died. It's triggered a whole debate, which is kind of similar to the one that's been playing out in the US with like campus protests. It's played into the politics as well, because the party running government now is kind of like our Democratic Party. And so they're feeling pressure from people on the left to be more critical of the way Israel is defending itself, and more sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinians. I don't know about Jewish people leaving Australia. I hadn't heard of that, but there is a strong and proud and large Jewish community here that continues to thrive.
I was
And
talking
my
about
hope
the,
is,
Go
I was
ahead,
talking
Bella.
the firebombing of the synagogue just this
yeah,
past week. Oh, because you
yeah.
said mosque. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Synagogue. I apologize. Thank you for picking that up. So yeah, the synagogue was bombed in Melbourne. So I mean, my hope is that this shocking act will jolt a bit of clarity into the debate in this country. It's just unacceptable. I mean, it's a terrorist attack, a hate crime, and in some sad ways, it is similar to some of the tensions we've seen in the US with kind of some of the protests and anti-Israel sentiment going overboard at times.
Anybody else want to weigh in?
I will say, Bella, just, my former boss who I served with in Israel, he's a senator in Australia now, and he's pushing, his party is pushing a piece of legislation that I think is cracking down on hate speech, and particularly this sort of anti-Semitism conduct in Australia. And I think that's getting a lot of traction. I think the majority of Australians are appalled by that sort of behavior, and it's not something that is widely accepted or widely supported. I think that there's been some people who have thought that this current administration, which are the Labor Party, left-leaning Labor Party, have been pandering to their base, to sort of use their words, which in some sort of Arab majority or Muslim majority areas and constituents. I mean, we have also seen that in the US, right? So I think this is something that is part of politics. And I just want to reassure you, though, that, Australia remains a very strong multicultural country that is not, I think, pushing Jewish populations out of the country, and they're still very much part of the fabric of our society.
Bella, thank you. Thank you for raising it. Really great questions. John, welcome in. Tell folks who don't know where you are, Tennessee.
Hey, Mark, I am in Tennessee. I am at work. No one is asleep. Everyone's out of the building. So just so you know, I'm an anesthesiologist. So,
okay.
We're safe. Everyone's safe. Jeremy, I've been to Noosa. Had a wedding there on New Year's Eve 6 years ago. And so it is a beautiful little part of your country. I've also been to the Zatri camp in northern Jordan, where my brother worked for about a decade, and met dozens and dozens of Syrian refugees. So as many others have said, including Hassan, clear win for Turkey, seemingly clear loss for Iran here. My question to the group would be, do we think this is a true, Russian weakness leading to an opportunity, or a strategic move by Russia as part of some broader game, with Turkey being part of NATO, whether it's related to Ukraine being forward with Trump coming in, whether it's related to BRICS and now Trump taking a harder stand on that? Is this somehow part of a Russian strategic move or a true Russian weakness?
Great question, John. Thank you. Folks, what do you think?
Yeah, it is a great question. There's always that problem, right, with closed regimes, to know whether they're like playing 4D chess or they're suffering losses. I tend to think it's a Russian move that they had to make because they're bogged down in Ukraine, and Hezbollah has been pretty much decimated, meaning that they had no role in Syria that was credible anymore. They didn't have access to a lot of the air bases that were being protected by Hezbollah ground forces. So I tend to think that the last thing Russia would have wanted was to leave Syria and potentially give up that naval base access that they have on the Mediterranean. It's their only naval base access there, and obviously Russian geography being what it is, that means they have to cross the Bosphorus when they want to get out of Sevastopol and Crimea. That's never a good thing. So I if you go back to geopolitical kind of analysis 101, you go, why would they have wanted to leave Syria? And I can't think of a reason why they would have wanted to leave Syria other than just going, the writing's on the wall and we don't want to lose our folks. And the other option would have been obviously to escalate and keep control and back Assad further. And that's where the Ukrainian side comes in, as I just don't think they have the ability to do that when they're currently fighting a huge war on the other side of the region, I guess, kind of.
Totally agree.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, John. And the other thing to keep in mind is that Russia had fought so hard to get the access to the warm sea ports, because Russia doesn't have any access to warm sea ports. It fought for that in Latakia in Syria, so it wouldn't have given that up very easily had it not been for those other calculations and looking like things were going to fall over for the Assad regime. So I think it was a fumble by Russia, actually, just sort of taking their eye off Syria, focusing on the Ukraine arena and realizing, oh crap, actually, this is too late to save.
John, is your brother also a doctor, or he just works with refugees?
No, he's we're opposite in almost every way. He's ended up getting a master's in neuroscience, but that's a long story. I'll tell you another time. But
Okay.
but yeah.
Underachieving family.
John, thanks for joining. Appreciate
Thanks.
always having you here. Thank you. Folks, thank you two, or you three rather. Tell people who want to read your newsletter how they can become subscribers to International Intrigue.
Helen, your turn to pitch. Go
First
ahead.
of all, tell them how expensive it is.
It's free, everyone. Can you
Okay.
believe it? There's no
Yeah.
catch. There's no such thing as
Yeah.
a catch. So I think I'm going to put International Intrigue, the website here, for everyone to sign up to. You can get onto the sign on page and click sign up, and you'll get your first newsletter starting tomorrow, and you'll get to read, see some entertaining reads, as well as great memes from Jeremy, as well, if you're into memes. So
Yeah.
please feel free
and if
to
you
sign
Google
up.
International Intrigue, you'll find it. It's the
Yeah.
top link.
I recommend
Yes.
it to you, folks. It's informative. They're very sensitive to their readers' times. It is free, but it's not super long, and they spend around the clock curating all the most important international news. And you'll see quickly if you start to read it, and I recommend it. They've got a different sensibility. There's great journalism in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, lots of international papers. But in English, if you want to understand it from a perspective of former diplomats, it's just different. And it's different. Doesn't mean that the other stuff isn't any good, but it's different and super valuable perspective every day. It's consistently great. And I read it, and you should as well. Grateful to the three of you for joining. We'd love having you here whenever there's a complex international story, and we hope to have you back regularly. And we hope you have a wonderful holiday, and you're all on call like Dr. John is. If there is breaking news, you're subject to recall of the chair. So don't go far.
We'll be here if anything happens. Thank you, Mark.
Okay.
And thank
Thanks
you,
all
everyone.
three of you. Really great to see you. Thank you
Thank
all
you,
for
Mark.
watching. Thanks everybody who asked questions. I'll be back tomorrow, 9 a.m. Eastern time with Sean and Dan for the morning meeting. We're going to definitely talk about Joni Ernst because there's some more we didn't get to. They just announced the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights nominee. And I suspect that means we may get some more. So if you're interested in Trump personnel, watch your inbox or Twitter or something. Grateful to you all for being part of it. See you at 9 a.m. tomorrow.